Handy Hudsonite here, talking with you about the difference between struts and shocks on your car. Struts are found on vehicles primarily in the front, though they can be found in the rear part of the vehicle as well. Some have four on the vehicle. There are certain vehicles that have a series of both, like I mentioned, and trucks can have a more complex array of struts and shocks just because, and Jeeps as well, but just because that they're required to do a fair amount of off-roading. But for the common vehicle, general vehicle, you have a set of struts in the front primarily, and the struts purpose is to uphold the car because you have a large compressor spring. You have the spring of the strut, and then you have a damper, or it's similar to a shock, but there are some differences, that's inside of the spring. Now the spring does a good job of making sure that when you go over bumps, the car is going to be able to absorb that impact. But the thing with springs that make them problematic on a car with just the spring itself is a spring is not going to be able to stop itself from that motion. So it's going to have all of this kinetic up and down motion, but no way of slowing down very quickly, eventually, but not quickly. So the damper, or the strut inside of the spring, what it does is it stops the spring from bouncing up and down. And so when you push down on the front of your car, it should bounce no more than one time, and definitely not more than two. If it does, then your struts are probably wearing out. And the difference between struts and shocks are merely a tube which will look similar to the strut tube, and their primary purpose is to slow the bouncing of the car. Now the one difference between the shock and the strut being that the shocks do not control the ride height of the vehicle. They have nothing to do with how high or low your vehicle is riding. So if that is happening in the rear of your vehicle, and it's not your shocks that are the problem, it's the spring and other parts of the suspension that could be failing on you. So the shocks are there merely to slow the bouncing of the car in the rear, and you want to make sure, again, when you do a test on it, that it's not bouncing more than once, definitely not more than twice, as you push up and down on the rear bumper of the car. Now struts and shocks also do help the car handle around curves better, gives you more control, and then also with stopping. If you have bad struts and shocks, when you go to stop, it's going to increase your stopping time, and stopping distance, I should say, dramatically, depending on how worn out they are. And you'll notice that with bad struts or shocks, or both, when you go to stop suddenly, you're going to essentially nosedive. The front of your car is going to tend to want to dip into the ground. And then if your shocks are bad, if you have shocks in the back, it will have the same effect if you reverse and then suddenly stop. And then as you're going around corners, you're going to tend to feel like you're more like in a boat, and you're kind of just floating around the corner, as opposed to when the shocks and struts are in good working condition, and you go around a corner and you can just feel it. It feels that it has tighter handling, and it's overall going to be more responsive. So if you have to avoid something very quickly by steering, if something is in the road, or you have to avoid even a person or another car, struts and shocks are going to be the best way of making sure your car has the best response time to avoiding that potential accident. And again, struts can be purchased as a kit, or they can be purchased as a unit. So you have the spring, the strut, and all the strut components together. Quick strut, Monroe Quick Strut is one. A lot of strut making companies come out with those, or you can buy the actual strut itself, and the actual strut is much cheaper and if you use that, then you ensure the original ride height of the car or truck because you're using the same spring. Because sometimes with these assemblies, if you buy the whole thing together, sometimes the spring is different if you're not buying OEM, and your car can end up being either higher or lower in the front or the back or wherever you're installing these struts. That actually happened to me. I replaced all the struts in my Toyota Camry, and now it rides much higher, which is fine with me. I actually like it when it rides a little bit higher, but it looks a little funny because there's so much of a gap above the wheels, above the tires. But if you get just the strut, then you're going to have it swapped out with the original springs. Now there are spring compressing tools so that you can do it yourself, but be warned, that is a very dangerous, potentially dangerous thing, because you are dealing with hundreds of pounds of stored pressure, if not thousands depending on your spring, and you run the risk of the whole assembly coming apart when you take off that top securing nut off of the strut. I actually did this recently with my Honda Odyssey, and turned out to be a good experience, though it was a bit of a nail biter trying to get the spring compressor tools, just figuring out how to work that safely and properly. But I did manage to figure it out, even though it took me a while. So that's the difference between struts and shocks, and the things to be aware of when it comes to those two components of your car. So you definitely don't want to let either one of them go bad on you and drive with worn out struts or shocks, because it's not just a matter of your car bouncing a little bit more. It is a huge safety issue with steering, with stopping, and just all around performance of the vehicle. Be sure to subscribe to my channel, The Handy Hudsonite, where I focus on tips, hacks, and reviews so that you can get the job done. Hit that notification bell, and I will look forward to seeing you in the next video.